Thank you. I think I'm just going to use your last slide to talk from. I'm going to try and offer some realist answers to these questions, which might be surprising because it's often been assumed or suggested that realism and social constructionism might not be compatible and might even be in conflict with each other. Perhaps that's encouraged by the fact that some prominent constructionists say things that appear to be quite anti-realist, and some, but not all of those, actually hold views that really are quite anti-realist. But I'm going to be arguing, as I did in this book, which started with I've argued that constructionism is entirely compatible with a realist perspective on society, and indeed a coherent realism requires a version of social construction, perhaps a version that abandons some of the more extreme things that have been claimed in social construction, but a version that retains the important parts of the argument. But let me address these questions. First of all, why do we care about social construction? And at the beginning of that, I think, is that it's simply impossible to understand many social phenomena adequately without recognizing that social construction plays a central role in a vast range of those phenomena. An obvious place to start here is with the work of John Searle, who tells us that a whole range of important social institutions have what he calls a subjective ontology. They depend for their very existence, as well as on their particular character and properties, on the ways in which we think about them. And indeed, and here I think I want to be a touch clearer than Searle, they depend on the ways in which we can collectively conspire to think about them. I use this word conspire deliberately to kind of destabilize any notion that this process depends on our conscious, motivated agreement to it. Very often we may be unknowing or perhaps even unwilling conspirators in the construction of certain social facts. But our de facto acceptance of, and indeed our de facto backing for, certain socially sanctioned ways of thinking, talking and acting makes us conspirators nevertheless in the construction of the social world. Why should we care? Well, first of all, as I suggested, because without a coherent concept of social construction, we can't understand many aspects of the social world. And secondly, because many of those socially constructed phenomena are vitally important to us all. So things like money, property, gender, nation, university degrees, absolutely vital to us all. How can we not care about something that lies behind those sorts of phenomena? And secondly, we should care because, or perhaps this is thirdly, we should care because once we recognize that these things are socially constructed, then it becomes clear that they could be constructed differently. And in particular, that many of these could be constructed in ways that are more or less oppressive, more or less conducive to human flourishing. So I think we should care about social construction. Let me move on then to the second question. What does the social in social construction stand for? What is social about social construction? And I think I've already started to answer that question with my talk of collective conspiracy. Property, for example, only exists because we collectively accept that it does. That acceptance leads to the action orientations that produce our decisions about how to act in cases where that notion of property is relevant. Our decisions about what to do or not to do in relation to the objects around us. It affects the decisions we make about mundane things like notebooks and pens and items of clothing, and much more socially significant things like houses and cars and stocks and shares and so on. So these orientations that affect our actions in a whole range of social contexts depend first of all on cognitive capacities that, as far as we know, are currently only possessed by humans. Social construction is something that only humans can do. And secondly, on the fact that via a variety of means of communication, we coordinate those action orientations and attitudes towards these socially constructed phenomena with other humans with whom we interact. It's not enough for one person, for example, to believe that property exists. If I think that property exists and therefore expect that no one else will take my coat and wear it, and no one else believes that, then there is no such thing as property. Property only comes about when we have a group of people who collectively accept that that's the case. All of these socially constructed things only come about when there's a group of people. A group of people who I'm going to briefly refer to as a discursive norm circle, but that's something we might want to ask more about later, I guess. It agrees to think and talk in that particular way that sustains that particular social construction. And this, in the end, is what is social about social construction. That it depends upon groups of human beings interacting in particular ways that depend upon a history of communication and interaction between them. Is that redundant? Absolutely not. What sorts of things can be socially constructed? Well, I've mentioned a few already, haven't I? Perhaps it's worth saying that this is a point where realists start to part company with some of the more extreme social constructionists. Some of those more extreme constructionists sometimes say that anything and everything is socially constructed, often on the grounds of neo-Kantian arguments about the inaccessibility of a world beyond language or discourse. But for realists, there is a clear distinction between those things that can be socially constructed and those things that cannot. Those things that can be socially constructed are those things that have what's so-called a subjective ontology. They are things whose very existence depends upon the ways in which we think about them. But there are plenty of other things that don't. I must use the classic realist example, a table, a piece of furniture. Those things come into existence as a consequence of a social process, but once they've been created, they are there, whether we believe in them or not. And of course, there are many more momentous things that equally exist independently of whether we collectively agree to believe in them or not. The sun, the stars, the sea, the temperature outside, all of those things are as they are, irrespective of what we choose to believe about them. So what is socially constructed is simply those things that depend for their existence on the ways in which we think and talk about it. How does it occur? Again, I've started to say quite a bit about that. Social construction is very much a discursive process. It depends upon a usually gradual process in which groups of people influence what individuals think. So the existence of property depends upon a process in which, over millennia, I guess, people have asserted rights about objects, come to accept what other people have asserted about their rights with regards to objects, and collectively and gradually built up a set of ways of thinking and talking and acting with regard to objects that we now think of as the concept of property, or the social phenomenon of property. So that's an important part of the answer. It's a discursive process. And I guess that my second part of my answer is also my answer to number 5, which is that the forces that lie behind social construction are partly the interpersonal processes of interaction that I've talked about. But it's also clear that social construction is something that is powerfully influenced by other major sources of social power. If we look at the construction of property today, for example, it's clear that the forms of property have been radically developed. The idea of digital property is particularly fascinating. Lots of us have in our pockets these sorts of things. Oops, it doesn't go off, by the way. I don't have to do anything with it. And on these gadgets, we can have music files. Now, if I want to put a music file on this, then there are people out there who will insist that I pay them for the privilege of doing that. Now, I own this gadget, I own all the bits and bytes inside it, I own the memory that's going to be reconfigured to make some sort of music file on it. But somehow the notion of property has been discursively reconfigured such that someone can have a property right in the pattern of bits and bytes on this gadget. And therefore I have to pay if I want to put that music file on my phone. So it's quite clear that the ways in which construction operates are shaped by major sources of social power. In this case, the power of the media corporations to influence the ways in which we collectively think, and the power of the state which they've managed to inveigle on their behalf. Okay, so let me then finish by talking again about this question of how constructionism and realism might be made commensurable or compatible. I'm going to address it as a question of how they might be made compatible. My first answer to that question is simply that everything that I've said so far in support of a moderate kind of social constructionism is thoroughly compatible with a realist understanding of the social world. This is a real causal process in a widely replicated form in which causal influence is exerted by a variety of interacting entities, people, organizations, the things I call norm circles, each of which has emergent causal powers as a consequence of its composition and structure. And the outcome of that process is a state of the world in which material entities, us human beings, come to have new mental properties that influence our subsequent actions. So social constructions depend for their continuing existence on the embodied properties of real material beings and the continuing beliefs they have about the interactive nature of their social environment. So this is a thoroughly real process, and it's hard to see how we can understand it in any terms other than those.